She was the soldier nobody remembered, until the day nobody survived without her. 12 elite operators, one narrow valley, 10 enemy snipers on the ridgelines above. And the only person who could see all of them was the quiet girl everyone spent months ignoring. Specialist Lena Cross had one rule, one promise she'd kept for 7 years, no matter the cost. Today, that promise was going to die in the dirt, and so would 12 men if she let it live. The rifle was right there. Her father's initials were on the stock. She picked it up anyway. If you're new here, subscribe now. Hit that bell. Drop your city in the comments because by the time this story ends, you'll want to tell someone where you were when you heard it. The base smelled like diesel and burnt coffee at 4 in the morning, and Specialist Lena Cross had already been awake for 2 hours. Not because she had to be, because sleep had stopped coming easy somewhere around the 3rd month in country, and lying in the dark listening to other people breathe wasn't something she could force herself to do anymore. So she was at her workstation in the comms hut, running signal checks on equipment that didn't need checking, drinking coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and watching the static patterns on the monitor like they were trying to tell her something. She was 24 years old, 5'6", lean in the way people get lean when they're always moving and rarely eating enough. Brown hair pulled back tight, eyes that most people described as gray, though in certain light they looked almost amber, a detail her father had pointed out once, sitting on a hillside in Wyoming when she was 11, telling her it was the same color as good glass on a quality scope. Her father had a way of connecting everything back to optics. Victor Cross. The name still did things to people who'd served in the right theaters at the right times. People would go quiet, or they'd get that look, the one where memory and grief and something close to reverence all showed up on the same face at once. Lena had seen that look her entire life and had learned to ignore it, or pretend to. She'd been ignoring a lot of things lately. The door to the comms hut banged open at 04:30, letting in a gust of pre-dawn cold and Sergeant Cole Mercer, who was technically her superior but operated more like a man who'd figured out that Lena would finish anything he didn't want to do. Cross. He dropped a folder on the desk beside her without looking at her. Convoy brief packet. Make sure those are organized before 0600. Captain wants clean copies. She looked at the folder. It was a mess. Papers out of sequence. Half of them missing page numbers. A 45-minute job minimum. Sergeant, that's administrative prep. That's not... It's whatever I say it is. He poured himself coffee from her pot, the pot she'd brewed, without asking. And when you're done with that, the secondary antenna mount on Tower 3 is throwing interference on Channel 9. Figure out what's wrong with it. Tower 3 has been flagged for maintenance twice this week. The mount bracket is Cross. He finally looked at her. He had the kind of face that had probably been decent-looking once, before years of doing as little as possible had softened everything into a vague pudginess. I don't need the explanation. I need the problem fixed. That's what you're here for. He took his coffee and left. Lena sat for a moment, didn't say anything, pulled the folder toward her and started sorting pages. That was the thing people never understood about her. She didn't argue, not because she was timid and not because she was a pushover. She didn't argue because she'd learned early that most arguments in the Army were theater, and the only currency that actually mattered was competence. You either had it or you didn't. Yelling about it either way changed nothing. She sorted the brief packet in 28 minutes. Then she went to fix Tower 3. The sun came up the way it always did in Kandahar province, sudden and brutal, like someone had thrown a switch. 1 minute it was cold purple dark. The next, the ridgelines were burning gold, and the air was already losing its chill, and you could feel the heat building up behind the light, like a wave getting ready to break. Lena was on her way back from Tower 3. Bracket had been cracked. She'd shimmed it with a piece of cut aluminum from her kit, would hold until actual maintenance got around to it, when she heard raised voices near the motor pool. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Holt was standing next to one of the vehicles in the convoy lineup, talking to a junior soldier with the particular brand of controlled fury that some NCOs mistook for leadership. Told you to check the tire pressure on all 6 vehicles, not 4. What part of all 6 suggests to you that 4 is acceptable? The junior soldier, barely 20, looked like he was still growing into his uniform, kept his eyes straight ahead. I ran out of time, Chief. The gauge was nothing. You ran out of effort. Holt turned away from him, and his eyes landed on Lena crossing the motor pool. She kept walking. She'd learned that too. Keep moving. Maintain a neutral expression. Don't give him a surface to push against. Cross. She stopped. Turned. Holt was mid-30s, built like someone had designed him specifically to be difficult to knock down. Former SEAL. Everyone on the base knew it because he referenced it, directly or indirectly, in approximately 60% of his sentences. He had the kind of physical confidence that had probably served him well in actual combat, and had since curdled into something that looked more like contempt for people who hadn't done what he'd done. You're on the convoy manifest. Yes, Chief. Communication support. Relay setup at, I know what the manifest says. He walked toward her slowly, the way some people do when they want the distance closing to make a point. What I'm asking is why. What exactly are you bringing to a security mission in a contested valley? I'm bringing communications capability, relay establishment, frequency coordination, emergency. You're bringing a body that takes up space in a vehicle and needs protecting. He stopped about 4 feet from her. You support personnel think a convoy is a field trip. You don't know what it looks like when things go wrong out there. Lena held his gaze. I know what the mission requires, Chief. Yeah. He looked her over once, not aggressively, more like assessment, the way you'd look at equipment you weren't sure was rated for the conditions. That's not what I asked. He walked away. The junior soldier behind him caught Lena's eye for a half second and looked away quickly, the silent solidarity of people who've been talked to the same way. She turned and kept walking. The early heat was already pressing down on the back of her neck. Owen Briggs was sitting outside the planning hut when she came back to grab her kit, drinking actual decent coffee from a thermos that he'd clearly brought himself, and watching the base wake up with the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove. He was 61, retired, technically a civilian contractor now, brought in for his institutional knowledge of the region. Gray-haired, weathered in a way that read as competence rather than age. He'd served 2 decades as a SEAL, and the difference between him and Holt was the difference between a man who'd done hard things and a man who needed people to know he'd done hard things. He'd known her father. More than known. They'd served together, trained together, trusted each other in the way that only happens when your life has depended on someone else's judgment more than once. When Victor Cross died, Owen Briggs had shown up at the funeral in a civilian suit with his hands folded and said, almost nothing, which Lena had understood even at 17 as the deepest kind of respect. He hadn't said much to her on this deployment either. Occasionally he'd sit near her during briefings. Sometimes he'd end up at the same table in the chow hall. Once he'd walked past her during a maintenance check and paused long enough to say quietly, Your father always checked the wind at 0400, said the morning reading was the honest one. She hadn't known what to do with that. She still didn't. This morning he just nodded at her coffee cup as she passed. That still warm? Not even close. Shame. He looked out at the ridgeline visible above the base perimeter. You sleep? Enough. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. Convoy's going deep today. That valley... He paused. Your father had a saying about valleys with high walls on both sides. I know the saying. Yeah. He took a sip from his thermos. I figured you did. She went inside to grab her kit. The convoy brief was held in a room that smelled like dry erase markers and too many people in a small space. 12 personnel total. A mix of Army and the SEAL element Holt was leading, plus Lieutenant Elias Grant commanding the overall mission. Grant was 29, West Point, the kind of officer who'd figured out early that the most important thing he could do was listen to the people around him who knew more than he did. Not a common trait. Lena had filed it away the first week as something worth remembering. She sat in the back row, the way she always did, with the brief packet in front of her, her organized numbered version, and listened while the S3 walked through the route. The objective was a ridgeline relay point, 6 kilometers into the valley, where they'd establish a communications node that would extend coverage to a series of observation posts that were currently running on degraded comms. Simple enough on paper. The valley ran roughly northeast, with cliffs on the western side, topping out around 800 meters, and a series of broken terraced ridges on the east that were lower but offered multiple covered positions. Lena looked at the terrain map while the S3 talked about radio frequencies. She wasn't looking at the frequencies. She was looking at the ridges, the eastern ones specifically. 3 distinct natural shelves at different elevations, each one with clean sightlines down into the valley floor. The western cliff face had two overhangs she could identify from the satellite imagery, both of which offered shade in the early morning and good concealment once the sun moved. She counted firing positions the way other people counted exits in a restaurant, without deciding to, without even entirely meaning to. 7 viable positions on the eastern ridge, 4 on the western face. The valley floor itself had 2 natural funnels where vehicles would be forced to slow. One at the 3-kilometer mark where the road bent around a rock formation, and one at the relay point itself, which sat in a slight depression. She looked at the depression for a long moment, made herself look away. "You're reading terrain on a comms relay mission," she told herself. "Stop." She looked back at the frequency chart. "Something wrong with the map, Specialist?" Grant. He was looking at her from the front of the room, curious rather than sharp. "No, sir. Just familiarizing myself with the route." He held her gaze a beat longer than necessary, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded and turned back to the brief. Across the room, she noticed Noah Pierce watching her. Pierce was the unit's primary sniper. Quiet guy, mid-30s, one of those people who operated at a consistent low volume that you eventually realized was not shyness, but a very specific kind of self-possession. He'd barely spoken during the brief, but he was watching her with an expression she didn't know how to categorize, like recognition. She looked down at the frequency chart. Stop. They rolled out at OH-700 in 4 vehicles, 2 armored HMMWVs and 2 MRAPs, Lena in the 2nd HMMWV with Grant and 2 other soldiers. Pierce was in the lead vehicle. Holt was in the trail MRAP. The first 2 kilometers were open ground, the kind of terrain that feels safe because you can see everything and everything can see you. Then the valley walls started closing in and the light changed. That particular narrowing of sky that happens when rock rises on both sides. And the air gets slightly cooler even as the sun climbs, and sound starts doing different things. Lena had her radio equipment checked and ready. She was supposed to be thinking about signal strength and relay configuration. She was watching the ridgelines. 3rd kilometer. The road bent around the rock formation she'd identified on the map. The vehicles had to slow to navigate the turn, and for approximately 40 seconds the convoy was in single file in a bottleneck, the rock face on the left, and a 20-meter drop on the right. Nothing happened. She exhaled slowly. Grant, sitting beside her, glanced over. "You've been watching the high ground since we left the wire." "Just doing my job, sir." "Comm specialists don't usually track elevation changes like that." He said it neutrally, without accusation. "I like to know where I am." He was quiet for a moment. "Owen Briggs told me something about you this morning." She looked at him. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Pay attention to what she notices. She notices things nobody teaches you to notice." Grant watched her reaction. He didn't say why. "With respect, sir, Owen Briggs is a retired contractor who served 30 years and knows the difference between a soldier who's alert and a soldier who's reading the ground." Grant turned back to face front. "I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm just telling you I heard him." 4th kilometer. The valley was fully enclosed now, cliffs and ridges pressing in from both sides. The sky reduced to a strip of hard blue directly overhead. The heat was building fast, the kind that bounced off rock faces and came at you from multiple directions. The radio crackled, Pierce's voice from the lead vehicle. "Grant, you seeing this? Wine's dropped completely." Lena felt it before Grant answered. The stillness. Not natural stillness. The valley had been carrying a slight crosswind since they entered, a consistent 2 or 3 knots she'd clocked without thinking about it. Now the air was completely flat. "Air doesn't just stop," her father's voice said in her head. Not a memory exactly, more like an instinct that had learned his accent. Air stops when something upstream is moving. "Grant," her voice was low and level, "we need to stop." He looked at her. "Right now. We need to stop the convoy right now." "Specialist, the wind dropped, all at once. That's not—" The first shot came from the eastern ridge. It hit the engine block of the lead vehicle with a crack that echoed off every rock face simultaneously, and for one frozen second the valley was nothing but that sound bouncing back and forth between the walls, getting louder instead of quieter, filling everything. Then the second shot came, and the third, and the ridgelines exploded. The echo of that first shot hadn't finished bouncing off the valley walls before Lena was already moving. She dropped below the window line of the HMMWV, one hand grabbing Grant's sleeve and pulling him down with her, the other bracing against the door panel as the vehicle lurched. The driver slamming the brakes without being told, pure instinct, which was either the right call or the wrong one, and there was no time to decide. Outside, the lead MRAP's engine was making a sound like something tearing, a high metallic grinding that meant the shot had found something critical under the hood. Pierce's vehicle was still rolling on momentum, drifting left toward the rock face. Then the valley came apart. Not one shooter, not two. The fire came from multiple points simultaneously: East Ridge High, East Ridge Mid, and at least two positions on the western cliff face that Lena had flagged mentally during the brief and now hated herself for not pushing harder on. The sound was enormous and wrong, the way gunfire in enclosed terrain always is. The reports stacking on top of each other and amplifying off the rock until it felt less like a firefight and more like the mountain itself was breaking. Contact, multiple positions, Eastern Ridge. Grant, you copy? Holt's voice on the radio, clipped and controlled, the way trained people sound in the first 10 seconds before everything starts costing them. Grant was already keying his handset. Copy. We're taking fire from West Face 2. I have at least 4 positions. Lena had 7. But she didn't say that yet. She pushed up enough to see out the window, 1 second, maybe 2, and mapped what she could. Lead vehicle pinned against the rock face. Passengers bailing out the right side into the minimal cover of a roadside drainage ditch. Second vehicle, hers, stopped in the open, the worst possible position, nothing between them and the eastern ridge, but 40 meters of flat gravel. Third and fourth vehicles had reversed instinctively and were now pressed against each other at the bend in the road, which gave them some rock coverage on the left, but created a bottleneck that would trap them if the shooters had anyone positioned lower. She dropped back down. Driver? The soldier behind the wheel was 22, maybe 23, white-knuckling the steering wheel and breathing through his nose in short, sharp bursts. What's your name? He blinked at her. Specialist Rowan. Rowan, back us up to the bend, slow. Don't gun it or we'll fishtail and end up sideways. The lieutenant, Grant. She looked at Grant, who was still on the radio. He glanced at her, then at Rowan, and gave a single nod. Rowan reversed. The vehicle moved back in a slow crawl that felt like it took 10 years, bullets pocking the gravel in front of them, and one round catching the left mirror and spinning it sideways. Then they were around the bend, and the direct line of sight from the eastern ridge was broken, and Lena let herself take one full breath. The radio traffic was deteriorating fast. 2 voices she didn't recognize reporting wounded. Pierce's frequency had gone quiet, which was either very good or very bad. Holt was coordinating the rear vehicles, trying to establish a perimeter that didn't really exist in a valley with no cover. Grant was on the command net requesting air support, and she heard the answer come back before he finished. Weather over the northern passes, a mission already committed, earliest available 45 to 60 minutes, an hour. In a fixed position, in a kill zone, with wounded personnel and no elevation advantage. 60 minutes was a very long time. How many shooters? Grant asked her directly. He'd closed his radio and was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not panic, but the specific focused urgency of someone who knows the information they need, exists and needs to find the person who has it. 10, she said. He stared at her. 7 on the east side, 3 west. They're using the overhangs for shade cover. That's why the satellite imagery didn't catch thermal signatures. They were there before dawn, let the rock cool around them. She paused. They've been set up since at least 0300. How are you? He stopped himself. Positions? East Ridge High, 2 shooters, offset about 30 meters apart. East Ridge Mid, 3 shooters in a staggered line. They're using the rock shelf as a natural parapet. Lower East, 2 more, probably covering the road for anyone who tries to run back the way we came. West Face, 1 high position under the north overhang, 2 more at the mid-cliff break. Grant was quiet for 3 full seconds. Outside, the fire had settled into a rhythm. Not suppressive, which would have meant burning through ammunition, but targeted, disciplined. They were conserving rounds and waiting. You're telling me 10 coordinated snipers are on those ridges? Yes. Based on what? She didn't answer that. Specialist Cross. His voice was careful. Based on what? Based on the firing angles. The shots aren't coming from random positions. They're interlocking. Each pair covers the blind spot of the adjacent position. That's not improvised, that's rehearsed. She met his eyes. Someone walked those ridges and planned this. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he keyed his radio. Holt. I need Pierce on comms now. Static. Then Holt's voice. Pierce is down. Took a round through the right shoulder at initial contact. He's stable, but he's out. The words settled into the vehicle like something physical. Grant closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. Their sniper was gone. Lena moved up to the lead vehicle 15 minutes later, using the rock face as cover for most of the distance, and then crossing the last 8 meters at a dead sprint that she felt in her lungs for a long time afterward. A round hit the gravel 2 feet to her right during the crossing. She didn't stop. Pierce was in the drainage ditch, propped against the rock face, his right arm immobilized with a field dressing that one of the SEALs had applied. Good work, tight, the right pressure. He was conscious and coherent, which was something. His rifle was lying in the gravel about 3 meters from him, where it had fallen when he went down. She crouched beside him. Pierce. He looked at her. His face was gray-white under his tan, the specific color of someone running on adrenaline and not much else. Cross. How bad? Through and through, I think. Shoulder. Can't. He tried to move his right arm and made a sound that he clearly hadn't planned on making. Can't use it. Don't try. She looked at the rifle in the gravel. An M110 semi-automatic sniper system, suppressed, with a loopholed scope. Stock worn from use in the particular way that came from a shooter who gripped it the same way every single time. She knew what the rifle weighed without picking it up. She looked away from it. How many can you see from here? She asked him. Pierce tracked her eyes to the rifle, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression. East Ridge Mid. I had eyes on 2 of them before I got hit. The high position is in dead ground from here. You'd need to be back at the bend with an angle into the north. What about the west face? North overhang is the kill position. The other 2 are support. They're watching the road, not the convoy specifically. If you could take the overhang shot, the other 2 would probably reposition, and that gives you a window. She was quiet. Pierce was watching her with that same expression she'd caught during the brief. The recognition that she still didn't know how to account for. Your father was Victor Cross, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. I trained at Bragg 3 years after he retired, Pierce said. His qualification record was still posted on the board. Nobody touched it. He paused, breathing carefully through the pain. I always wondered if he had kids. He had a daughter, Lena said. She does communications work. Pierce held her gaze. Didn't smile. Didn't push. Just nodded slowly, like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected for a while. She looked at the rifle again. 7 years. She hadn't touched one in 7 years. The last time had been a week after her father's funeral, when she'd gone out to the range behind his house in Wyoming. The private range he'd built, 200 meters through the trees, the targets he'd painted himself on plywood boards, and she'd shot until her shoulder was bruised and her vision was blurred and she didn't feel anything anymore. Then she'd put the rifle in the case, driven it to her mother's house, and told her mother she was done. Her mother had held her for a long time. Promise me, she'd said. Not angrily, not as an ultimatum, just quietly, the way her mother said all the things that mattered. Promise me you won't become the thing that took him. Lena had promised. She stood up from Pierce's side. I need to get back to Grant. Cross, she stopped. That rifle's not doing anyone any good lying in the gravel. Pierce's voice was even, without pressure. I'm just saying. She walked back to the bend. What up? The situation had deteriorated in the 15 minutes she'd been gone. One of the SEALs, a staff sergeant named Dawes, had taken a grazing wound to the left thigh trying to establish a better firing position, and was now sitting behind the rear MRAP with his leg wrapped and his expression suggesting he was furious about it. 2 of the Army soldiers were combat ineffective from shock, not wounded but frozen in the particular way that happened sometimes, the way nobody talked about in training. Holt had them behind the vehicles and was not being gentle about getting them functional again. The enemy fire had changed rhythm, less frequent now, more deliberate, single shots probing the cover positions, keeping everyone's heads down. Testing. They're going to move, Holt said. He'd come forward to where Grant was, crouching behind the second HMMWV. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. They've got us fixed in place. Next phase, they push people down from the ridges to close the distance. Air support is 40 minutes minimum, Grant said. We don't have 40 minutes in a stationary defense. What do you want me to do about it, Chief? Holt didn't answer that. His eyes moved to Lena, standing at the edge of the group, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened, not exactly, but recalculated. Like he was solving an equation he hadn't expected to have to solve. You were talking to Pierce, he said, checking on him. You were looking at his rifle. She didn't respond. Holt stepped toward her. Not aggressive, more deliberate than that, more careful. The fury she'd seen in him all these months was still there, but it was compressed now, shaped by something more urgent. I've been watching you since we rolled out. You've been tracking those ridgelines since kilometer 1. He paused. You saw the positions before I did. I ran a 2-year sniper pipeline. I know what someone looks like when they're reading elevation and distance instead of just looking at rocks. She held his gaze. Who are you? He asked. Not dismissive now, just the question. Specialist Lena Cross, Communications. That's not what I asked. The radio crackled. A voice she didn't recognize. One of the soldiers in the ditch near the lead vehicle. Movement on East Ridge Mid. They're repositioning. Something's shifting up there. Holt didn't look away from her. We have no sniper. We have no air. We have 3 minutes before those shooters move to a position where they can drop grenades into this ditch. His voice was flat and direct in a way she actually respected more than anything he'd said to her in months. If you have something to offer right now is the time. Grant was watching her too. So was Dawes, from his position by the MRAP, leg wrapped and eyes alert. She thought about her mother, about the house in Wyoming and the way the air smelled on that range through the pine trees, cold and clean, and carrying the faint scent of gunpowder that never entirely left. About a promise made in grief, in love, in the specific kind of fear that comes when you've already lost one person to a rifle and you can't survive losing another. She thought about the man in the ditch 30 meters away with a through-and-through shoulder wound and his rifle in the gravel. I need a spotter, she said. Getting back to Pierce's position the second time was harder because the enemy had repositioned exactly the way the radio call had warned. The East Ridge mid-shooters had moved left, which closed off the partial cover she'd used before. She went flat on her stomach and crawled the last 12 meters with her elbows and knees, eating gravel, feeling rounds cut the air above her close enough that she could hear them passing. Not the crack that meant near miss, but the specific whisper zip that meant closer than that. She reached Pierce's position, breathing hard and tasting dust. He looked at her when she came in beside him, looked at the expression on her face. Didn't say anything, just used his good left arm to slide the rifle toward her. She put her hand on the stock. The weight was familiar in the way that things are familiar when you learned them before you learned anything else. She'd been 8 years old the first time her father let her hold a rifle. Not shoot, just hold, just feel the balance, feel where the weight lived. You have to know it before you can use it, he'd said. And you have to know yourself before you know it. She brought it up, positioned, checked the scope. Leupold Mark V, good glass, set to 12 power. She dialed it without thinking about dialing it. The adjustment automatic, hands finding the turrets the way hands find light switches in a dark, familiar room. East Ridge High, Pierce said quietly, slipping into the spotter role with the ease of someone for whom it was just another function. He had a small monocular in his left hand pressed against his eye. 2 shooters, north overhang on the west face is your priority. That's the command position. I think the shot caller is up there. She found the west face overhang in the scope. 520 meters, she estimated. The angle was awkward. They were below and to the south, shooting up and across, which meant the bullet's path would curve more than a level shot at the same distance. She'd need to hold high and left. The wind was still flat, which was either good luck or bad information. Wind check, she said. Mirage is running left to right, slight, maybe 1 knot at our position. No idea what it's doing at the target. 1 knot at the shooter, unknown at the target. She thought about the valley's shape, the way it funneled air, the way the morning sun would be creating thermal lift off the eastern rock faces and drawing cooler air from the west. The crosswind at the target would be slightly higher than at their position. Not much. Maybe 1.5 knots. She dialed, found the overhang. There was a shape there. In the shadow, pressed back against the rock, just the slight geometry of a human outline that didn't quite match the natural fracture patterns of the cliff face. Most people wouldn't see it. Most people would see shadow and rock and empty space. Her father's voice. They hide in the geometry, but geometry has rules. Rock breaks in straight lines. People don't. Her breathing slowed. She didn't decide to slow it. It just happened, the same way it had happened on that range in Wyoming, the same way it had happened 100 times before she was 17 and told herself she was finished with all of this. The crosshairs settled. She was aware distantly of the sounds around her, the ongoing crack of fire from the ridge, someone shouting a position update on the radio, the grind of metal that meant one of the vehicles was being moved, Pierce's quiet breathing beside her. She was more aware of the shape in the overhang, the way it was set, the slight forward lean that meant whoever was up there was looking through an optic, concentrating, choosing a target. Breathe out. Half. Hold. Her finger found the trigger the way it always had. Not with intention, with memory. You don't have to do this, Pierce said quietly. She didn't answer him. But if you do, he paused. East Ridge High is going to see the muzzle signature when you fire. Even suppressed, the rock face will bounce it. You'll have about 4 seconds before they redirect. 4 seconds. 2 shots if she was fast. 3 if she was very fast. She settled deeper into position. Tell me when Grant needs it, she said. Pierce keyed his radio with his left hand. Grant, we're set. Your call. 3 seconds of silence on the net. She imagined Grant at the bend, weighing what Pierce had just told him against everything he knew and didn't know, trying to calculate the odds of a communications specialist actually being able to do what that sentence implied. Then his voice, quiet and deliberate, take it. She exhaled half a breath, held, and found out what 7 years had and hadn't done to the thing her father had built in her. The trigger broke clean. The shape in the overhang stopped moving. She was already adjusting to the East Ridge High before the sound of the shot finished crossing the valley. The second shot broke before the echo of the first had finished crossing the valley. East Ridge High, north position. She'd already placed him during the spotter call, filed the geometry away while her finger was still on the trigger for the overhang shot, the way her father had drilled it into her on the Wyoming range when she was 13 years old. You don't find the next target after the shot. You find it before. The shot is just the end of a process that started 30 seconds ago. The figure on the East Ridge High dropped out of his position and didn't come back up. 2 shots, 2 down. 4 seconds elapsed. Then the valley erupted. The remaining shooters had located the muzzle signature. Suppressed didn't mean silent, and the rock face had done exactly what Pierce warned it would, bouncing the report in a way that compressed and redirected the sound. 3 rounds hit the drainage ditch in rapid succession, throwing gravel and dust in a curtain that turned the air brown. Pierce pressed himself flat against the rock with his good arm, and Lena was already rolling left, 3 full-body rotations, putting 2 meters of lateral distance between herself and the position she'd fired from. She came up behind a rock shelf about the size of a washing machine and pressed her back against it, rifle across her chest, breathing hard. "You good?" Pierce called. "Yeah." "That was fast." She didn't answer. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed that, filed it, didn't spend time on it. Over the radio, Pierce's handset, which she could hear from 3 meters away, Grant's voice came through stripped down to its essential components. 2 down. Confirm? Pierce keyed with his left hand. Confirmed. 2. We've got 8 still active and they know where we are. Need to reposition. Can she move and still engage? Pierce looked at Lena. She was already scanning the rock shelf, looking for the next covered position, mapping the angles she'd lose and gain if she moved 20 meters north along the ditch. Yes, she said. Pierce relayed it. Grant came back. We're going to push the rear vehicles forward on my mark. Give you covering noise. 30 seconds. She used the 30 seconds to move. North along the ditch, staying below the rock lip, rifle cradled against her chest to keep the scope from catching rock and going out of zero. Pierce moved with her, slower, one-armed, wincing in a way he was clearly trying to keep quiet, but wasn't quite managing. She grabbed his good arm at one point and pulled him through a gap between 2 boulders that he'd have had to go around otherwise. I've got it, he said. I know you do. She didn't let go until they were through. New position. The angle to the East Ridge mid was better here. She was slightly higher relative to the mid-shelf, which meant she could see over the natural parapet the shooters were using. It also meant they could see her more easily if they knew where to look, which was the trade-off, the thing you always had to decide between in this kind of work. The vehicles behind her roared, all four engines at once, a coordinated surge of noise, and under cover of that sound, she came up over the rock lip and found the East Ridge mid in the scope. The three shooters there had shifted position after her first two shots, moved laterally along the shelf, which was what trained people did when a sniper started working their line. But the shelf only had so much room and the natural parapet had only so many good gaps, and the new position the middle shooter had taken put his left shoulder past the edge of a rock fin in a way that the old position hadn't. She found the gap, dialed the range. She estimated 410 meters, slightly closer than the west face shot, the angle sharper. Wind had picked up slightly since she'd last checked, the thermal lift off the eastern face starting to run now that the sun was fully over the ridge. She felt it on her left cheek, half a knot maybe, deflecting right to left at this angle. Pierce pressed beside her. Left shooter is the one with the radio. See the antenna? She did. A small black antenna stub visible above the rock line, attached to a radio pack on the shooter's back. Command node. If he was relaying position information to the other teams, taking him first disrupted the coordination. Left first, she said. Agreed. The shot. The antenna disappeared. She was already moving the crosshairs to the center shooter before the left shooter finished falling, and she took that shot, and the center position went quiet, and then she was tracking right, and the third shooter on the mid-shelf was moving, had seen the other two go down and was pressing himself against the back of the parapet, trying to get small, trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. She waited. 3 seconds. 4. He had to breathe, had to shift his weight, had to do something because nobody could hold perfectly still under that kind of adrenaline. Nobody, not even people who'd trained for it. The body always betrayed you eventually. He moved his head left to look for her. 5th shot. Pierce exhaled slowly beside her. 5 for 5. Her shoulder hurt. Pierce's rifle had a slightly different length of pull than she was built for, and the repeated recoil was loading her shoulder at a slightly wrong angle. A small thing that would become a larger thing if she kept shooting. She rotated the shoulder, felt the joint pop. You need to adjust the stock, Pierce said. I know. There's a release on the... I know how to adjust the stock, Pierce. He closed his mouth. She adjusted the stock. 2 centimeters shorter. Much better. Over the radio, Grant's voice. Cross status. She keyed Pierce's handset. 5 down, 5 remaining. East Ridge low, 2 shooters. They're covering the road behind us, probably have instruction to move up once they think we're suppressed. West face, 2 support positions, mid-cliff break. And 1 more somewhere I haven't located yet. A pause. You said 10 total at the brief. I said 10. I've confirmed 9 positions. The 10th has been quiet since initial contact. She looked at the valley walls, thinking. He's either the furthest back, a long-range position I haven't been able to resolve, or he's moved. Or he was never where you thought. No. She was sure of that in a way she couldn't fully articulate, the way certainty sometimes settled without showing its work. He was there. I just don't know where he is now. Another pause. Then, keep going. Holt's element is going to push east along the ditch. Try to get eyes on the low ridge positions. I need you to clear the west face first so they don't have fire on them during the move. Copy. She looked at the west face. The 2 remaining support positions were at the mid-cliff break, a natural horizontal fracture in the rock face, about 2/3 of the way up, maybe 640 meters from her current position. Long shot, cross valley, shooting into the shadow of the fracture. She'd need to come out of the ditch entirely to get the right angle, which meant exposure. I need to move to the road, she told Pierce. He looked at the road, 40 meters of open gravel with no cover. That's a bad idea. Yes. I mean, it's genuinely, specifically a bad idea. Pierce. Yeah. I know it's a bad idea. He was quiet for a moment. I'll talk you across on the radio. Call the fire for you. No. She handed him the handset. You stay here and maintain comms with Grant. If I get across and they don't see me, I want quiet. And if they do see you? She picked up the rifle. Then I need to be fast. She got across the road. Not cleanly. A round hit the gravel 3 feet ahead of her on the sprint, close enough to throw grit against her shins, and she felt the pop of it in her chest, the way you feel near misses. Not pain, but the phantom awareness of what could have been. She dove behind the remains of a culvert on the far side of the road, a concrete half-pipe that gave her maybe 40 centimeters of cover if she stayed flat. Not enough to shoot from. She needed to come up. She thought about the west face. The two shooters in the mid-cliff break were support, not primary. Their job was to keep heads down, not to pick specific targets, which meant their attention was likely on the vehicles in the ditch, the visible concentration of soldiers, not on a single person flat behind a culvert in the middle of the road. Probably. She came up fast, found the first shadow in the scope, fired, dropped back behind the culvert before the echo moved. Came up again 3 meters to the right of where she'd been, found the second position, fired. 2 rounds. 2 positions. She wasn't sure on the second one. The shadow had shifted as she pulled the trigger. She'd either caught him transitioning or she'd missed. She stayed behind the culvert with her pulse loud in her ears and waited. Nothing came from the mid-cliff break. 7 down, she thought. 3 remaining, including the one she hadn't located. She keyed the radio on her own handset, her comms unit, which she'd been carrying the whole time and which felt faintly absurd now, the radio equipment she'd come out here to install sitting useless in a bag while she used a sniper rifle. Grant, west face is clear. Holt can move. A pause. Then Holt's voice, not Grant's. Confirmed. We're moving. She heard them. The scuff of boots in gravel, the low communication of hand signals being backed up by whispered commands, the sound of people moving under stress, but moving with discipline. Holt's element, 6 operators, pushing east along the ditch in a column. She repositioned to cover them. East Ridge Low had 2 shooters, and those 2 shooters were going to have a clear line on Holt's element once the column moved past the first vehicle. She needed to be on them before that happened. She moved back across the road, slower this time, with a different kind of fear, the sustained kind that settles in once the initial adrenaline starts evening out, and came up the ditch line to a position 30 meters north of where she'd been. The East Ridge Low was close, maybe 280 meters, short range for a rifle like this, which meant high-speed geometry. The bullet's drop over that distance was minimal, less than she was used to accounting for, and she'd need to hold slightly low or she'd shoot over. She found the first low ridge position. The shooter there was well placed, behind a natural rock pile that gave him 360 protection except for a gap at the top where he'd have to expose his head and shoulders to fire down into the valley. He was using that gap now, tracking Holt's column. She waited until he was fully committed to the shot, until he was in his scope, and the part of his brain that was evaluating and calculating had pushed aside the part that was scanning for threats. Her father's voice. The moment a sniper fires, he's the most vulnerable he'll ever be. He's given everything to the shot. There's nothing left for self-preservation. She fired a half-second before he did. The second low-ridge shooter reacted immediately. This was a trained person who understood the tactical situation and wasn't going to freeze. He dropped below his rock pile and shifted position. She heard him moving, the scrape of boot on stone, and tracked the sound, trying to anticipate where he'd reappear. Holt's voice on the radio, sharp. Contact, east low, single shooter still active, we're pinned. I have him, she said. Hold. A beat of silence on the net. She could imagine Holt's face on the other end of that radio. She watched the rock pile. The shooter had 2 options. Reappear on the left side, where he'd have a shot down the ditch, or reappear on the right side, where he'd have a shot across the road. The left side gave him a better angle on Holt's column, which was what he was there to engage. He'd go left. He went left. She'd already been holding there. 9th shot. Clear, she said. The ditch was quiet for a moment. Then Holt. 9 down, 1 outstanding. Yes. Where? I don't know yet. A long pause. In the background, she could hear his element moving again, resuming the push east, but carefully now, with a specific kind of caution that came from knowing there was one trained shooter unaccounted for in a valley where every rock looked like cover. She changed positions. She'd been in the same general area too long, and the unaccounted shooter worried her more than any of the 9 she'd already engaged, because the ones she hadn't seen were always the ones that found you. She moved south, back toward the vehicle position, staying in the ditch. 50 meters. She went slowly, scanning high, scanning the valley walls, looking for the geometry that didn't fit, the shape that didn't match the natural fracture pattern of the rock. The valley had gone relatively quiet. The ongoing fire that had been defining the last 40 minutes had dropped to almost nothing, and that quiet felt fragile, like ice you weren't sure would hold weight. She stopped, listened. Wind had picked up slightly again from the west. She could hear it moving across the top of the valley walls, that particular low tone that wine makes when it's going over rock. She could hear the vehicles, engines cooling, the tick of metal contracting in the heat. She could hear Pierce, still at his position north of her, shifting his weight against the rock. She could not hear the 10th shooter. Grant's voice, quiet on the radio. Lena. Her first name, not her rank. She noticed that. Holt's element is at the relay point. They need 5 more minutes to establish cover. What's your status? Still looking for the last one. Okay. A pause. Take what you need. She appreciated that he didn't tell her to hurry. She worked back through what she knew. 10 shooters, a coordinated setup, rehearsed interlocking fields of fire. The mission had been specifically targeted. This wasn't opportunistic, it was planned. Someone had walked those ridges, placed those shooters, assigned sectors of fire. The command node had been the left shooter on the East Ridge mid, the one with the radio. She'd taken him in the 5th shot, which meant the 10th shooter had been receiving orders from that node, which meant the 10th shooter knew the node was gone, which meant he'd been operating on last orders for the better part of 30 minutes. Last orders, in this context, would have been something like maintain position until signaled, and if comms go quiet, use initiative. Use initiative. For a trained shooter in a failing ambush, use initiative meant one of 3 things: extract and report, find a new firing position, or find a priority target. She thought about priority targets. The vehicles were burning. The tactical situation was clearly degrading for the ambush force. If she were the 10th shooter and she'd just watched 9 of her team get taken down by a single shooter she couldn't locate, what would she do? She'd find the shooter. She'd stop trying to engage the soldiers, and she'd find the person dismantling her team. The realization arrived the way realizations sometimes do in the middle of quiet, not as a sudden insight, but as a slow, cold settling, like temperature dropping. He wasn't watching the convoy anymore. He was watching the ditch line. He was watching for her. She went completely still. Didn't breathe. Just listened and let her eyes move without moving her head, scanning the valley walls in slow arcs, looking for the one thing that was looking back. And she found him. Not on the ridgeline. Lower. He'd come down from wherever he'd been set up and repositioned to a boulder field on the eastern slope about 150 meters from the valley floor, close enough that his original position must have been very far back. A long-range anchor point for the ambush, a fallback sniper nest. He'd moved down because the ridgeline was dead. Everyone on the ridgeline was dead. He'd adapted. He was good. He was also, at this moment, looking directly at the section of ditch where Pierce was. Not at her. At Pierce. Because Pierce had been making noise, adjusting his position, keying the radio, doing the things that injured people do when they've been sitting in gravel for 40 minutes with a hole in their shoulder. Small noises. Normal noises. But enough. She watched the 10th shooter settle into his position, watched him find Pierce in his scope, watched the slight shift of weight that meant he was moving from target acquisition into pre-fire. "Pierce," she said, just loud enough. "Move! Right now!" Enough. "Move! Right now!" She heard Pierce move, a scramble, not graceful, his good arm pushing off the rock. And simultaneously she was up, fully exposed above the ditch line, with the rifle on the boulder field. She had maybe 2 seconds. He hadn't seen her yet. He was tracking Pierce, recalculating for the movement. She found the right boulder, found the shape behind it. Her shoulder was burning from the wrong angle recoil she'd been taking all afternoon. Her hands had a faint tremor she was managing, but not eliminating. She was running on whatever the body runs on after adrenaline has been burning for an hour, and she'd eaten nothing since 4 in the morning. The crosshairs moved, settled, moved again. "Stop," her father's voice said. "You don't chase the target. You bring yourself to stillness and let the target come to you." She stopped chasing it, brought herself to stillness. The crosshairs settled. She fired. The boulder field went quiet. She stayed up for 3 more seconds, scanning, making sure. Nothing moved on that slope. Nothing moved anywhere on the valley walls. Then she lowered the rifle and sat back against the ditch wall and put her face in her hands for exactly 5 seconds. Not crying, not falling apart, just taking 5 seconds for herself before the world came back in. It came back in with Pierce's voice. Cross. Yeah. You all good? Working on it. Okay. A pause. 10 for 10. She didn't say anything to that. I've been shooting for 14 years, Pierce said. I've never done 10 for 10 in a sustained engagement. I haven't shot in 7 years. A long silence. Well, Pierce said finally, you might want to reconsider that policy. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. Grant's voice on the radio, and this time it was not clipped or tactical. It was just a man saying words and meaning them. Clear Valley. All positions confirmed. Holt's element is secure at the relay point. Medevac is inbound. 12 minutes. A pause. Outstanding work, Cross. Outstanding. She looked at the rifle in her hands, the worn stock, the scope with its crisp glass, the way the weight of it had stopped feeling borrowed somewhere in the middle of the second engagement and had just started feeling like weight. Her hands were still not entirely steady. They might not be steady for a while. She thought about her mother, about Wyoming, about a promise she'd made in a kitchen that smelled like pine sap and coffee and grief. She thought about the 12 people in this valley who were going to get on a helicopter. She wasn't going to resolve those two things today, probably not for a long time. But she sat with both of them while the rotors grew audible in the distance, and the valley filled with the sound of helicopters coming in from the north. And somewhere up on the eastern ridge, the wind started moving again through the rocks and the silence of 10 empty positions. Holt's voice came on the net last. Not to Grant, not a tactical call, just Cross. She keyed the handset. Chief? I owe you an apology. She didn't answer right away. Looked at the valley walls, at the sky narrowing to blue above the cliffs. We'll talk at base, she said. The helicopters broke over the southern ridge and the whole valley filled with their sound, and Lena Cross sat in a drainage ditch in Condora province with her father's rifle. Because it was her father's rifle, she'd known it the moment she picked it up, known it from the wear pattern on the grip and the particular way the stock sat, and something else she couldn't name, and waited for the noise to reach her. It did, and it was loud, and it felt like something ending and something else beginning, and she didn't know yet which one was going to matter more. The medevac came in hard and fast, the way they always did when the LZ was still considered hot, flaring at the last second and touching down in a cloud of rotor wash and dust that turned the valley air brown for 30 seconds. Lena stayed in the ditch until the crew chief waved the all clear. Then she stood up, and the world tilted slightly. Not badly, just enough to remind her that she'd been running on adrenaline and bad coffee for 6 hours, and her body had opinions about that. She put one hand on the ditch wall, waited for the tilt to stop, then walked toward the helicopter. Pierce was already being loaded. He'd refused the stretcher until 2 of Holt's operators had stopped asking and just picked him up, at which point he'd accepted the situation with the dignity of a man who was in too much pain to argue effectively. His shoulder dressing had bled through on the outer layer, but the pressure was holding. He'd be fine, which was the only category that mattered right now. Dawes went on next, leg wound, still furious about it. The 2 soldiers who'd frozen during the initial contact were standing near the rear MRAP looking at the ground. One of them, the younger one, barely 20, a private Lena didn't know well, was shaking in the specific way people shake after the adrenaline leaves, and the brain starts trying to process what just happened. Not dramatic shaking, just a fine tremor in his hands that he kept trying to stop by making fists. She walked past him and then stopped. She didn't know exactly why she stopped. She wasn't a counselor. She wasn't his squad leader. She had a rifle in her hands, and her own hands weren't entirely steady, and she had nothing particular to offer. She stopped anyway. Hey, she said. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, but dry. It gets processed, she said. Not fast, but it does. He stared at her. She could see him trying to figure out what to do with that, whether it was reassurance or fact or something else. How do you know? He said. She thought about it honestly, because it had to. She kept walking. Tut-tut. The flight back to Fort Redwood took 22 minutes. Lena sat against the fuselage wall with the rifle across her knees, watching the terrain scroll past through the open door, ridgelines dropping away, the valley disappearing into the mountain geography that had been trying to kill them an hour ago and now just looked like rock. Holt was across from her. He hadn't said anything since the radio exchange in the ditch. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor, in the posture of a man doing work inside his own head that he wasn't ready to bring outside yet. Grant was up near the cockpit, on the radio, doing the administrative labor of a mission going wrong and then right. Initial reports, personnel status, the endless bureaucratic scaffolding that the Army wrapped around every significant event. He'd been on the radio since they boarded and showed no signs of stopping. Owen Briggs was not on the helicopter. He'd been at Fort Redwood when they left, and Lena realized she didn't know if he'd been looped into what happened yet. She thought about his face that morning, the way he'd said her father's name without saying it, the way he'd talked about the valley like he already knew what it was going to do. She looked down at the rifle. The initials were on the underside of the stock, stamped into the wood in a way that was almost invisible unless you knew to look. VC, small and precise. Her father hadn't been sentimental about his equipment. He'd told her once that marking your gear was bad practice, made it too easy to identify. But he'd marked this one. She didn't know how it had ended up in Pierce's hands. That was a question she was going to need an answer to eventually, and she suspected Owen Briggs was going to be part of that answer, and she wasn't sure how she felt about any of it. She put her hand over the initials and kept it there for the rest of the flight. Fort Redwood was not quiet when they landed. Word had traveled faster than they had. It always did. Some combination of radio traffic and the particular way bases processed news about casualties and firefights. Information moving through informal channels in the 20 minutes before official reports caught up. By the time the helicopter touched down, there were people at the pad who had no operational reason to be there. Lena stepped off last. She was carrying the rifle in her right hand, walking next to the medical team that was taking Pierce to the aid station, and she was aware of people looking at her in a way that felt different from the way people usually didn't look at her. She kept her eyes forward. Sergeant Mercer was standing near the motor pool, watching her come off the bird. She caught his face for a second. Something on it she hadn't seen before. Something that looked like the early stages of embarrassment working its way toward the surface. She didn't stop. The aid station first. She wanted to make sure Pierce was handed off properly, that the transition from field dressing to actual medical treatment went cleanly. She stood outside the aid station entrance for 10 minutes until one of the medics came out and confirmed he was stable and prepped for evac to the main medical facility at Bagram. Then she went to find somewhere to sit down. She ended up at her workstation in the comms hut, which was where the day had started, and which felt appropriate in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. She set the rifle on the desk beside her keyboard, looked at it. Her coffee from the morning was still on the desk, completely cold, hours old, a thin film forming on top. She drank it anyway. She was on her second cup, fresh this time from the machine that made bad coffee efficiently, when Colonel Victoria Hale walked in. Hale was 53, short, with gray coming in at her temples that she'd stopped fighting around the time she made full colonel. A decision she'd mentioned exactly once in passing and clearly never thought about again. She commanded the installation with a particular style, not loud, not theatrical, but so consistently present that you felt her attention even when she was 3 buildings away. People performed better in her AO. Most of them didn't fully understand why. She came in without knocking, which was her prerogative, looked at Lena at the workstation, looked at the rifle on the desk, and pulled a chair over without being invited and sat down. "Talk to me," she said. "Not sit down, Specialist, or I've read the initial report or any of the approach building language that most officers used when they were about to have a significant conversation. Just talk to me." Lena talked. She laid it out the way she'd learned to lay things out, chronologically, factually, without interpretation. The brief, the terrain read, the convoy movement, initial contact, Pierce going down, her assessment of the positions, the decision to pick up the rifle, the sequence of engagements, the 10th shooter. She described it the way she'd describe a communications relay problem. Here is the situation. Here is what I assessed. Here is what I did. Here is the outcome. Hale listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad in front of her, but she didn't write anything on it, just held the pen and listened. When Lena finished, the colonel was quiet for a moment. You identified 10 coordinated shooters from a moving vehicle during initial contact, she said. Yes, ma'am. And you said nothing about this assessment during the brief. I noted terrain concerns, ma'am. Chief Holt. She stopped. I noted terrain concerns. Hale looked at her steadily. That's not what I asked. Lena met her eyes. I assessed the terrain as potentially compromised. I didn't have confirmation, and I was a communication specialist with no tactical authority in that vehicle. My read was, it felt like the kind of observation that would be received as interference. Because of Chief Holt. Because of the dynamic in that vehicle. Hale set her pen down. That dynamic got people shot. Yes, ma'am. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The rifle, Hale said. She looked at it on the desk. Pierce's inventory shows that as his assigned weapon. It is also based on what I've been told in the last 15 minutes by Owen Briggs, not actually Pierce's rifle. Lena looked at the rifle. No, ma'am. How did Victor Cross's personal weapon end up in Pierce's kit? A question she still didn't have the full answer to. I don't know. I recognized it when I picked it up. You're sure it's his? He took it to every deployment from 2003 to 2011. He had it rebuilt once at a private gunsmith in Cheyenne, and he kept the original barrel. I helped him clean it when I was 16. She paused. It's his rifle. Hale absorbed that. I'm going to need you to walk me through your training background, Specialist Cross. Officially. For the record. Here it was. The part she'd been carrying for 7 years like a stone she'd agreed to carry. My father started teaching me to shoot when I was 8. Not casually. Formally. With intent. He treated it like a second education. She kept her voice even. By the time I was 14, I was shooting at ranges that qualified at the advanced level. By 16, I could hold my own against most trained snipers in controlled conditions. I never pursued a formal sniper qualification because... She stopped, started again. I made a choice, after he died, not to pursue it. I enlisted in communications because I wanted to serve, and I wanted to be as far from a rifle as I could put myself. Why? The honest answer was complex and personal, and she wasn't going to give all of it in this room. She gave the part that was relevant. My mother asked me not to, after my father died. She let that sit. He was killed downrange, long-range fire. He was... Another stop. He died doing exactly what I just did. She didn't want the same thing for me. Hale was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the bass sounds continued. Vehicles, voices, the distant mechanical noise of the flight line. I understand that, Hale said. Not performatively, just directly, the way she said everything. Yes, ma'am. And I need you to understand that what happened in that valley today is going to require a formal inquiry. Not because you did anything wrong, you saved 12 lives, and I will say that plainly and in writing as many times as it requires. But because a communication specialist engaged and neutralized 10 enemy combatants using an unaccounted weapon, and the Army has processes for that, and we're going to follow them. I understand. You're not in trouble, Cross. I know, ma'am. Hale looked at her for a moment longer. A considering look, the kind that took stock without being invasive. Owen Briggs is waiting outside. He says he has something that belongs to you. Lena looked at the door. Send him in when you're ready, Hale said. She stood, picked up her legal pad. The formal debrief is at 0800 tomorrow. Get some sleep if you can. She paused at the door. Outstanding work today, Specialist. I mean that without reservation. She left. Lena sat for a moment in the quiet of the comms hut. Then she got up and opened the door. Owen Briggs was outside in the same posture she'd left him in that morning, sitting on a bench, thermos in hand, like a man who had learned that the world moved at whatever pace it moved at, and fighting that was a waste of energy. Except his thermos was closed and his hands were around it rather than drinking from it, and his eyes, when he looked up at her, were doing something she didn't have a name for. You knew, she said. Not accusatory, just the fact of it. He stood up. He was holding a sealed envelope in his other hand, she noticed. Letter size, the paper slightly yellowed, her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized the way you recognize a voice after years away from it. Her father's handwriting. He wrote it before his last deployment, Briggs said. He gave it to me and told me to hold it. Told me if he came home he'd take it back and burn it. If he didn't, He stopped. He said to give it to you when you were ready for it. When I was ready. That was what he said. How did you know I was ready? Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Because you picked up the rifle. She took the envelope. It wasn't heavy, just a few pages. She could tell from the feel of it. She looked at the handwriting on the front. Her name, just her name, written in her father's particular way, the L slightly larger than necessary, the way he'd always written it. The rifle, she said. How did Pierce have it? Briggs exhaled. Pierce trained under a man named Galloway at Bragg. Galloway was your father's student, one of the people Victor trained off the books, the way he sometimes did with people he thought deserved better instruction than the formal program was giving them. When your father died, Galloway inherited the rifle. He retired last year. Pierce was his shooter. She thought about that. A chain of custody that ran from her father to a soldier she'd only known for 3 months, and had ended with the rifle lying in gravel in a valley in Kandahar province. He knew, she said. Galloway. He knew whose rifle it was. He knew it had belonged to a significant person. Your father never told him the full history. She looked down at the envelope. Pierce asked me if I was Victor's daughter. Pierce is perceptive. He said he recognized me. Briggs nodded slowly. You shoot like him. The stillness before the trigger, the way you move between positions. He had a particular economy. Nothing wasted. You have the same thing. A pause. I recognized it the first week I was here. I've been trying to figure out when to tell you that. You could have told me. You'd made a promise. Wasn't my place to push against that. He held her gaze. Still isn't. That's between you and your mother. She looked at the envelope again. He was proud of you, Briggs said. Not of what you could do. Of who you were. He talked about that distinction a lot toward the end. The difference between capability and character. He thought you had both. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. She stood with the envelope and waited. I'll leave you to it, Briggs said. He walked away. She stood outside the comms hut in the early evening. The sun was going down behind the western mountains, the light going amber and then orange and then red, the same brutal efficiency with which it had arrived that morning. She didn't open the letter yet. The formal debrief the next morning was in the installation's main conference room, which was nicer than the planning hut. Actual chairs, a proper table, a projector screen showing the valley terrain map with all 10 positions marked in red. Someone had done that overnight, she realized. Gotten the satellite imagery and the after-action report and plotted every shot. There were 8 people in the room, Hale at the head of the table, Grant to her right. 2 JAG officers. Legal, she'd expected that. An intelligence officer she didn't recognize. A sergeant major named Estrada, who ran the installation's training programs and had the look of a person who'd been doing this long enough to be surprised by almost nothing. Holt. Across the table from her, 2 seats down. And Lena. They started with Grant's account, the convoy, the contact, the tactical situation. He was precise and clear, and he didn't editorialize. When he got to the moment she'd said they needed to stop, he didn't gloss over it or minimize it. Specialist Cross identified the threat before contact, he said. I didn't fully act on her assessment because I didn't have context for it. That's on me. One of the JAG officers made a note. Then it was Holt. She watched him as he spoke. He'd slept, she could tell. Not well, but some. He was in his dress uniform, which she rarely saw him in, and the formality of it made him look slightly unlike himself, like a version of him that existed for official occasions and wasn't entirely comfortable in its own skin. He walked through the initial contact, his element's response, the communication with Lena's position. He was accurate. He didn't embellish anything in his favor. When he got to the part where she'd reported 10 positions, he paused. I want to be clear, he said. At that point, I had confirmed 3 positions. She reported 10, with specific elevations and angles of fire. My first response was skepticism. Another pause. My first response was wrong. Nobody said anything. In my assessment, Specialist Cross demonstrated tactical awareness during initial contact that exceeded her assigned role. Her engagement of the 10 enemy positions was, he stopped again, choosing the word, precise, sequential, executed under sustained incoming fire with no support structure. It was the best individual marksmanship performance I have personally witnessed in 14 years of service. The room was quiet. Holt looked at Lena directly. That's my official statement and it's accurate. She held his gaze, nodded once. Then it was her turn. She'd prepared for this the way she prepared for communications briefs, organized, sequential, with specific callouts for each decision point. She walked through her terrain read during the convoy movement, her conversation with Pierce, the moment she picked up the rifle, each engagement in sequence, distance, wind conditions, her adjustments, the shot outcomes. The intelligence officer stopped her 3 times to ask follow-up questions, each time with the slightly careful tone of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. You estimated 10 coordinated shooters from a moving vehicle, under stress, during initial contact, he said on the 3rd stop. That estimate was accurate. Yes. How? Firing angles, the geometry of the interlocking fields of fire. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how sniper teams are placed. In your communications training? No. A beat. My father trained me, she said, informally, over many years. His approach was comprehensive, not just marksmanship, but tactics, terrain reading, team structure, how coordinated shooter teams work, how they think. She kept her voice level. I never pursued formal qualification because I chose not to. That doesn't mean the training wasn't thorough. The JAG officer leaned forward. For the record, Specialist, you picked up a weapon that wasn't your assigned equipment, in a combat situation, without explicit authorization from your chain of command. Grant authorized it, she said. On the radio. Take it, were the words. Lieutenant Grant authorized a shot, not sustained engagement of multiple targets. Grant spoke from across the table. I authorized whatever she assessed as necessary. That was my intent, and I'll put it in writing. The JAG officer made another note. Hale was watching all of this with the expression of a person who already knows how the story ends and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. The weapon, the intelligence officer said. We've confirmed through serial number records that it was originally the personal property of Master Sergeant Victor Cross, retired, KIA 2015. Can you explain how it ended up in Specialist Pierce's inventory? She explained. Galloway, the informal training legacy, the chain of custody. As she talked, she watched the faces in the room shift slightly, the intelligence officer's expression moving from procedural to something more attentive, Estrada's weathered face going still in a way that suggested he recognized the name Victor Cross and was processing its weight. When she finished, Hale spoke for the first time since the debrief started. The weapon is being logged and held. We'll work through the ownership question administratively. She looked at Lena. My intent is to return it to you. Victor Cross's next of kin, once the process is complete. Lena's hands were flat on the table. She pressed them down slightly to keep them still. Thank you, ma'am. The debrief ended at 10:30. People filed out in small groups, JAG together, the intelligence officer with his notes, Grant stopping to say something quietly to Hale before following. Estrada lingered near the door, looking at the terrain map, and then left without speaking to anyone. Lena was gathering her things when Holt stopped beside her. He didn't immediately say anything. He stood there, and she could feel him working up to it, the particular human difficulty of saying a thing you should have said differently before and now have to say correctly. She waited. I've been doing this for 14 years, he said. I know. I've operated with a lot of people, a lot of different skill sets. He paused. I categorized you in the first week, decided what you were and weren't capable of, and filed it away and didn't revisit it. Yes. That cost us. He said it flat and direct, the same way he said everything. Not today. Today worked out. But in a different valley, with different timing, it could have cost us. That's on me. She looked at him. He wasn't comfortable and he wasn't performing discomfort. This was the genuine version, a man saying a true thing about himself in a room where it could be heard. You're good at your job, she said. That's not in question. Neither are you. He paused. I didn't act like that was possible. No. I'm sorry for that. Flat and direct, same as everything else. The sincerity in it was not theatrical. It was just there, the way the facts of the debrief had been there. She nodded. Okay. He waited, like he expected more. Chief, she said, I've been living with people underestimating me my whole life. I'm not looking for a speech about it. You saw it. You said so on record. That's enough. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "You need a formal sniper slot," he said. "I'm going to put that recommendation in writing." "I know you are." Something almost shifted toward a smile on his face. Almost. He walked out. Mercer caught her in the hallway outside the comms hut in the afternoon. He'd been avoiding her since she'd gotten off the helicopter. She'd noticed the avoidance the way she noticed everything, without much investment in it. And now he was standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who'd rehearsed something and was hoping he could get through it. "Cross," he said. She stopped, held her radio kit in one arm, waited. "I heard what happened out there." He shifted his weight. "I wanted to say, Mercer." She kept her voice even. "You don't owe me anything." He blinked. "I was going to apologize." "I know, you don't have to." She shifted her kit to the other arm. "I don't need it. I need the secondary antenna on Tower 3 to get a proper maintenance order written, and I need the convoy brief packets for this week's schedule to be done by the person who's assigned to do them." She looked at him. "That's what I need from you." He stared at her. "That's it?" he said. "That's it." He stood there for another second, visibly off balance. He'd prepared for a different kind of conversation, she could tell. One where she had things to say and he had things to receive, and the dynamic between them shifted in a way that felt significant. She was denying him the significance of it. That was intentional. "Okay," he said finally. "Good." She walked past him. She heard him say quietly to the empty hallway behind her, "Right." Grant found her at the rifle range at 4 in the afternoon. She'd gone there with the rifle after the debrief concluded. Not to shoot at first, just to sit with it, do a proper field strip and clean, let her hands do something they understood while her brain processed the last 24 hours. But then she'd put 3 rounds downrange at 200 meters and then another 3 at 300, and by the time Grant walked up, she was on her 7th magazine and had basically stopped thinking about anything except the fundamentals. He sat down on the bench behind her and didn't say anything for a while. She sent 3 more rounds into the 300-meter target and then put the rifle down and looked at the target through the scope. Tight group. She drifted slightly right on the last shot. Fatigue, probably, her grip going slightly inconsistent as her shoulder tired. "How are you?" Grant said. "I don't know yet." "Fair answer." She ejected the magazine and set it aside. "Is this going to be a problem? Long term. The inquiry." "No." He said it without hedging. "Hale's going to have you nominated for the Bronze Star. Holt's recommendation for a sniper slot went in this morning. Apparently, I heard it from Estrada. The JAG review will close clean." He paused. "The problem you're actually asking about isn't the inquiry." She looked at him. "The problem you're asking about is what comes next," he said, "whether you lean into it or walk away." She looked back at the range. The targets, small at distance, the bullet holes in them visible even from here, as small dark marks that the wind didn't move. "My mother," she said. "Yeah." "She's going to find out. If there's an inquiry, if there's a nomination, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I promised her." "I know." Grant was quiet too. Then, "Can I say something without it being out of line?" "Go ahead." "Your promise was to stay safe. To not become another casualty." He paused, choosing carefully. 12 people got off helicopters yesterday because of you. I don't know how your mother will weight that, but... He stopped. "That's all I'm going to say." She sat with that. The range was quiet except for the wind coming down from the mountains and moving through the target frames, a sound like something breathing. "My father left me a letter," she said. Grant said nothing, just waited. "I read it last night." She'd sat in the comms hut with it until midnight, reading it twice, then folding it exactly as it had been folded and putting it in her breast pocket. She could feel it there now. He said he wrote it before his last deployment, so he didn't know how it would end. He said he hoped he'd come home and take it back. He said if he didn't... She stopped, started again. He said, "Your silence has never been weakness, but there are moments when silence becomes its own kind of violence. When the world needs you to act and you don't. Promise me you'll know the difference." Grant was very still beside her. "He knew," she said. "He knew I'd promised my mother. He knew I was going to carry both things." She looked at the distant targets. "He was telling me it was okay to choose." What are you going to choose? She picked up the rifle, set it back against her shoulder, found the 300-meter target in the scope, breathed out, fired. The round hit center. She lowered the rifle. I'm going to call my mother tonight, she said. That's what I'm choosing first. Grant nodded. He stood up from the bench. For what it's worth, he said, watching you work yesterday was one of the most remarkable things I've seen in 8 years of active service. He said it the way he said things, plainly, without decoration. Your father would have had opinions about that. He would have found 3 things I did wrong. That's how you know it was good enough. He walked away. She stayed at the range until the light started going and the target at 300 meters became hard to distinguish from the shadows around it. Then she cleaned the rifle one more time, slowly, and put it in the case. She called her mother from the satellite phone in the comms hut at 9 in the evening, Kandara time, which made it early morning in Ohio, where her mother lived now in the house she'd bought after selling the Wyoming property because she couldn't look at the mountains anymore. It rang 4 times. She was about to hang up when her mother answered. Lena. Her mother's voice, hoarse with early morning and something else. I already know. Owen Briggs called me. She closed her eyes. Of course he did. He told me you were safe first. He made sure to say that first. I'm safe. A long silence on the line. She could hear her mother's breathing, the particular pattern of it, familiar across 24 years, the slight catch that meant she was holding something back. Mom, don't apologize, her mother said. Don't you dare apologize for saving people. Lena was quiet. I need you to be safe, her mother said. That's still true. That will always be true. Her voice was steady, the way her mother's voice was always steady when it mattered. But I've been holding that promise like it was the same thing as keeping you safe, and I think, a pause, a breath. I think that was about me, not you. Mom, I watched what I loved about your father disappear because of that work. I didn't want to watch the same thing happen to you. Another pause. But Owen said, he said watching you today was like watching your father when he was at his best. Not the part that scared me. The other part. The part that was... She stopped. The part that was who he actually was. The comms hut was very quiet around Lena. The static of the satellite connection, her mother's breathing. I don't know what I'm doing yet, Lena said honestly. I know. I broke the promise. I need you to know that Lena. Her mother's voice was firm. Not angry, just firm. You saved 12 people. Your father would have done the same thing. I would have wanted him to do the same thing. A pause. The promise was wrong. I was scared and I asked you for the wrong thing. That's my fault. She didn't know what to say to that. Come home when you can, her mother said. We'll talk properly, face to face. Another pause. And bring the rifle. Lena blinked. Owen told me about it, her mother said. I want to see it. After they hung up, Lena sat in the comms hut for a long time. The static of the disconnected line had gone quiet, and the room was just itself again. The monitors, the equipment she'd been running checks on for 3 months, the cold coffee, the hum of electronics. She took her father's letter out of her breast pocket and smoothed it on the desk in front of her. Read the last line again. Promise me you'll know the difference. She folded it back exactly as it had been, put it in her pocket. Then she pulled up the formal application form for the Army sniper course and started reading it. Estrada found her in the comms hut at 7 the next morning. She'd slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected. The cot in the barracks had felt different somehow, not more comfortable. The mattress was the same sad object it had always been. But she'd gone horizontal, and her body had made an executive decision, and that was that. She woke up with her father's letter still in her breast pocket and the application form still open on her laptop. Estrada knocked on the door frame, which she appreciated. Most people with his rank and his number of years in service had stopped knocking on things. Sergeant Major, she said. He came in, looked around the comms hut in the way experienced soldiers look at spaces, not nosily, just cataloging, and pulled a chair over. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with hands that looked like they'd done serious work, and a face that had been in enough weather to carry the evidence of it. He'd been running training programs at Fort Redwood for 3 years, which meant he'd seen a lot of people come through and had developed an economy about which ones he gave his attention to. He was giving her his attention now. I watched the after-action footage this morning, he said. Grant had a helmet cam running from the vehicle. It caught some of your engagement on the eastern ridge. She hadn't known about the helmet cam. How much? Enough. He laced his fingers together and put his hands on the table. I also pulled your service record last night. Clean. No negative flags, 2 commendations for communications work, 1 for maintaining signal integrity during a forward operation last spring that apparently kept a medevac from going to the wrong LZ. He paused. Nothing that would tell you what happened yesterday was in there. No, Sergeant Major. Your father's record, I know. I was a staff sergeant at Fort Benning when he was still active. I never served with him directly, but his qualification scores ran through the training community for years. People still reference the long-distance shot he made in Ramadi in 2008. He looked at her steadily. The one that saved a 4-vehicle convoy that was 30 seconds from being completely overrun. She knew the shot. She'd heard the story so many times in her childhood that she could have described the wind conditions and the distance from memory. History has a pattern, she said. It does. He didn't make it dramatic, just the observation. What I want to know is whether yesterday was an exception or a demonstration. Sergeant Major? Some people can perform under extreme duress in a specific moment and then never replicate it. Crisis response, essentially, the body and mind rise to a singular occasion and then return to baseline. He watched her. And some people are operating below their actual level constantly, and crisis just removes the ceiling temporarily. He paused. Which one are you? She thought about the range yesterday afternoon, the consistent groups, the way the fundamentals had come back not like something recovered, but like something that had never actually left. The second one, she said. That's what I thought. He unfolded his hands. The sniper course application you pulled up last night. Holt's recommendation is going in today, as I understand it. Mine is going in this morning. Colonel Hale has already spoken to the program coordinator at Bragg. He said all of this in the same even tone, like he was reading a maintenance schedule. The course starts in 6 weeks. The slot is yours if you want it. 6 weeks. She thought about what 6 weeks meant. The remaining time on this deployment, the administrative process, the phone call she'd had with her mother last night, and the things that call had left unresolved. Not badly, but in the way of things that needed more time and more words, and a kitchen table and 2 people sitting across from each other in person. I want it, she said. Estrada nodded. Just want once. Good. He stood up. There's one more thing. She waited. The 10 enemy combatants you engaged yesterday, intelligence had a preliminary ID on 2 of them by this morning. Both were known elements of a network that has been operating in Kandahar province for 4 years. The coordinated nature of the ambush, the pre-positioned setup, the interlocking fields of fire. He paused. This was a planned interdiction. Someone in that network had information about this convoy's route and timing. She'd suspected something like that since the valley. The level of preparation wasn't consistent with opportunistic ambush. The intelligence officer, she said, from the debrief. Captain Yoon. Yes, she'll be coming to talk to you separately. Not about the engagement, about your terrain read. Specifically, she wants to understand how you assess the command position. He looked at her. The shooter you took in the overhang shot. He was the network's senior tactical coordinator for the region. His loss is significant. She absorbed that. I'm telling you this, Estrada said, because you should know that what happened yesterday had operational value beyond the 12 people on that convoy. I don't say that to make it feel cleaner than it was. It wasn't clean, he paused. But it mattered. After he left, she sat for a while with that. It mattered. She'd known it mattered. She'd known it in the valley, in the most immediate and physical sense. 12 people in vehicles below ridgelines that were trying to kill them. But the other kind of mattering, the broader consequence, sat differently. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about it. She suspected it was going to take longer than one morning to figure out. She poured coffee and went back to the application. Captain Yoon arrived at 11. She was younger than Lena expected, late 20s, with the particular focused quality of someone who spent most of their professional life processing information and had gotten very efficient at it. She brought a laptop and a terrain map and no small talk. I'll be direct, Yoon said, sitting down across from Lena. The position you identified as the command node, the west face overhang, is not visible on our satellite imagery from the prior 72 hours. We had that valley under observation. We didn't flag it as a concern. The overhangs have deep shade in the morning, Lena said. If they moved into position before dawn and the rock face cooled around them, our thermal imaging would have caught them moving in. Depends on when you were looking. Yoon looked at her. What do you mean? Thermal imaging has observation windows. You're not running continuous coverage on every valley in the province. If they moved into position during a gap, Lena paused. What was your last thermal pass over that valley before 0600 yesterday? Yoon checked her laptop. Her expression shifted slightly. 0147. So they had a window from 0147 onward. The western overhang at that time of morning, the rock temperature would have been dropping fast, 2 or 3 degrees per hour after midnight. If they were in position by 0230, they'd have been almost ambient temperature by 0600. Your thermal pass would have shown the overhang as a cold rock surface. Yoon was quiet for a moment. You knew that before the convoy rolled out. I suspected it. I didn't have confirmation. You didn't raise it in the brief. I raised terrain concerns. She held Yoon's gaze. They were received poorly. Yoon looked at her for a moment, then made a note. I'm going to need your complete terrain assessment from the brief. What you saw, what you suspected, when you suspected it, for the intelligence review. I'll write it up today. Good. Yoon paused. Can I ask you something off the official record? Lena nodded. The way you read that terrain in a moving vehicle, during initial contact stress, Yoon frowned slightly, not negatively, more the frown of someone trying to understand a data point that doesn't fit their model. That's not something communications specialists do. It's barely something trained JTAC personnel do. What were you actually doing in that brief while everyone was looking at frequency charts? Counting firing positions. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the terrain required it. Because the valley shape was wrong for the mission profile. Because my father taught me that you never enter enclosed terrain without knowing where the fire would come from if it came. She paused. I wasn't planning to use that information. I just couldn't stop collecting it. Yoon absorbed that. Your father's training was comprehensive. It was everything. Yoon closed her laptop. For what it's worth, the intelligence picture in this province looks different this morning than it did yesterday. That's a direct consequence of your engagement. She stood. I'll be citing your tactical assessment in my report as an example of ground-level pattern recognition that our overhead collection missed. With your permission. You have it. After Yoon left, Lena sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The morning had been a series of people telling her things that were going to take time to settle into their proper place. She was aware of that, aware that she was storing rather than processing, that the processing was going to happen later, probably in pieces, probably at inconvenient times. That was fine. That was how it worked. Pierce called from the medical facility at Bagram at 2 in the afternoon. She heard his voice on the satellite phone and something in her chest loosened slightly. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd been carrying the question of how he was doing. How's the shoulder? She said, held together with surgical intent and sarcasm. His voice was rough from the medication but clear enough. They're talking about 6 to 8 weeks, which is annoying. You'll recover full function? They say yes. Ask me in 8 weeks. A pause. I heard Estrada went to see you this morning. News travels? It always does. Another pause. He put in for the sniper slot? Yes. Good. His voice was quiet. You know, when you adjusted the stock, mid-engagement, that's a thing people forget to do. They take the discomfort and keep shooting because stopping feels like losing momentum. He paused. Your father taught you that. He taught me everything. I know. He was quiet for a moment. That rifle is yours, Cross. Whatever the administrative process says, it's yours. Galloway would want that. I want that. A pause. It shot better for you than it ever shot for either of us. I don't know how to explain that except to say some things know who they belong to. She had her hand on the rifle case on the desk beside her, had put her hand on it without deciding to. Thank you, Pierce. Don't thank me. I'm just a guy who got shot in a ditch. She could hear the tired humor in it. You did the hard part. After they hung up, she sat with the case for a while. Then she opened it and took the rifle out and held it the way her father had taught her to hold it when she was 8 years old. Not to shoot, just to know it, to feel the weight and the balance and where the center of gravity lived. She held it until it felt like hers. Then she set it back in the case and went to write up her terrain assessment for Captain Yoon. What? Hale called her to the command office at 4. The Bronze Star nomination paperwork was on the desk when Lena came in. She could see the header from where she stood, the official form with her name at the top. Hale didn't draw attention to it. She had Lena sit, and then she sat down herself and looked at her in the direct, unadorned way she looked at everything. The nomination goes up the chain today, Hale said. Bronze Star with Valor device. Grant's written the citation. Holt co-signed it. She paused. I want you to know what's in it before it moves, so there are no surprises. She slid a copy across the desk. Lena read it. The citation was precise and factual, and she recognized Grant's voice in the construction of it. The same clarity he brought to everything, language that described the events without inflating them. Specialist Cross demonstrated exceptional valor under direct enemy fire, neutralizing 10 enemy combatants in a sustained engagement that prevented the loss of 12 personnel. It went on. She read all of it. When she looked up, Hale was watching her. The Valor device is warranted, Hale said. Anyone who questions that is welcome to walk that valley and explain to me an alternative interpretation. Yes, ma'am. How are you feeling about all of this? The question was genuine, not administrative. Lena considered it genuinely. I feel like I'm still processing it. That's appropriate. It's been 36 hours. Hale folded her hands on the desk. The thing I want you to hear, and I mean this as your commanding officer, not as someone delivering a speech, is that what you did yesterday was not an anomaly to be explained away. It was a capability that was always there and was, until yesterday, entirely invisible to the institution. She paused. That's a failure on our part, not yours. Lena was quiet. You managed your promise to your mother, Hale continued. You managed your grief about your father. You managed years of working under people who assigned you a ceiling based on your job title. She looked at her steadily. And you did it without becoming bitter about it, which is a kind of strength that doesn't show up in qualification scores. I was angry sometimes, Lena said honestly. Mercer, Holt. I was angry. Good, you should have been. Hale allowed a small, dry thing that wasn't quite a smile. Anger at injustice is appropriate. It's what you do with it that defines you. She paused. You turned it into competence. That's the right answer. Lena looked at the citation on the desk between them. Her name at the top, the events of yesterday rendered in formal language, the Valor device recommended in the signature block. My father never got to see me do anything, she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended, not as an expression of grief, just as a fact. He died before I enlisted. He trained me for years and then he was gone and all of it just sat there, unused. Hale was quiet. Yesterday was the first time I did anything with what he gave me, Lena said, and he wasn't there to see it. He'll never see it. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Hale said. That's the kind of thing that finds its place over time, not because the grief gets smaller, but because what you build around it gets larger. Lena nodded. Hale slid the nomination form to the side and placed her hands flat on the desk. 6 weeks to the sniper course. Between now and then, you're still my communications specialist. Tower 3 still needs its maintenance order. The relay equipment from yesterday's mission needs to be inventoried and logged. She paused. Life continues at its regular administrative pace regardless of what else is happening. Yes, ma'am. But, Hale held her gaze, when you get to brag, and you will get to brag, I want you to go there as what you are, not as something you're apologizing for, not as something you're explaining. A pause. You're Victor Cross's daughter, and you're better than almost anyone I've seen in a combat situation, and you have a lot of years of service ahead of you. Walk in there like all three of those things are true. Lena looked at her. They are true, Hale said. She walked back to the comms hut in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the western mountains again, the base doing what it did at the end of every day. Settling into its evening routine, the shift changes and the chow hall, and the particular winding down quality of a military installation at dusk. She sat at her workstation, pulled up the maintenance order form for Tower 3, and started filling it out. The rifle case was on the desk beside her keyboard. She'd been carrying it with her all day without fully deciding to, the way you carry things that have found their proper weight. She finished the maintenance order, submitted it, started the terrain assessment for Yoon. Worked until the comms hut was fully dark outside the windows and the base had gone quiet around her. And when she finally looked up from the screen, she realized she'd been at it for 3 hours and had produced 12 pages of the most precise tactical analysis she'd ever written in her life. She read it back, made 3 small corrections. Then she opened her email and wrote a single sentence to her mother. "I'll be home in 4 months. Save the kitchen table for me." She sent it, closed the laptop, put her hand on the rifle case one more time, briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it's still there. It was. She turned off the light and went to get some sleep. 4 months moved the way deployment time always moved. In 2 speeds simultaneously, certain weeks dragging through heat and paperwork and routine until each day felt identical to the one before it. And then suddenly, a month was gone and you couldn't account for where it had been. Lena accounted for hers. The terrain assessment she'd written for Yoon became a 17-page intelligence document that Captain Yoon cited in a provincial threat assessment that went up 3 levels of command. Lena didn't find that out until weeks later, from Estrada, who mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, briefly, without ceremony, as if the information was simply available and she might want it. The Tower 3 maintenance order got processed in 9 days, which was a record for this installation. She suspected Hale had something to do with that, but couldn't prove it. Mercer submitted his own paperwork for rotation home 2 weeks after the Valley. He didn't announce it. He was just gone one morning, his workstation cleared. A brief note on the shared drive acknowledging the handover of his responsibilities to a staff sergeant named Kowalski, who arrived from Fort Campbell and did his own work without explanation or apology. The change was quiet and complete, and Lena found she had almost nothing to say about it either way. She and Holt worked together 3 more times before her orders came through. Convoy support, twice, and a communications relay operation in the northern sector that required 4 days in the field. He was different with her now. Not soft. Holt was constitutionally incapable of soft, but calibrated differently, the way a precise instrument gets recalibrated after it's been found to be running off true. He asked her opinion on terrain twice, not for show, because he wanted it. She gave it plainly, and he received it the same way, and that was the shape of what they became, which wasn't friendship exactly, but was something functional and honest, and she respected it more than she would have respected anything theatrical. Pierce sent her a message from the recovery facility in Germany at the 6-week mark, shoulder at 80%, shooting at 60. See you at Bragg. She wrote back, "You won't be in my class." His response, "No, I'll be on the evaluation board." She stared at that for a moment, then put her phone down and went back to her frequency charts. Her orders came on a Tuesday. Fort Bragg, Special Operations Training Command, Advanced Sniper Course, class start date 6 weeks out, reporting date 5 weeks and 4 days from now. She read the orders twice, folded them, put them in her breast pocket alongside her father's letter, which had been there since the night she'd read it, and which she'd made no move to relocate. The 2 pieces of paper had been in the same pocket for 4 months now, and she'd stopped noticing the weight of them, which seemed right. She told Hale first, which was proper. Hale looked at the orders, then at her. "How do you feel?" "Ready," Lena said. Then, more honestly, "nervous." Both of those are correct responses. Hale set the orders down. "The course is hard, you know that. I've read everything I could find about it. Reading about it and doing it are different things." Hale paused. "You'll be the only woman in your class, possibly the only specialist, depending on who else comes in. Both of those things will generate noise." "I know. How will you handle it?" Lena considered. "The same way I always have, by being better." Hale looked at her for a moment. "That's the right answer. It's also an exhausting answer. At some point, you're going to want to be able to just be in a room without having to justify your presence in it." "Yes, ma'am." "That point comes. I'm telling you it comes." Hale held her gaze. "It doesn't come in this class, but it comes." She believed her. Owen Briggs was at the airfield when her transport out was scheduled to leave. She hadn't told him her departure time. She'd mentioned it was Tuesday, and he'd apparently extrapolated from there. He was standing near the terminal building with his thermos and his patience, watching the flight line the way he watched everything, like a man who'd learned that most things worth seeing required waiting for. She walked over, put her bag down. They stood together for a moment. You don't have to do the send-off thing, she said. I know I don't. He took a drink from his thermos. I wanted to. She looked at the aircraft on the line. Her transport was the third one, a C-130 that looked like it had been tired for decades and had developed an indifference to the fact. He would have hated this part, she said. All of it. The Bronze Star, the nomination, people making it into a story. Yes. Briggs didn't pretend otherwise. He was allergic to recognition, spent his whole career trying to do significant things quietly. He paused. Didn't always work. He would have said I did 3 things wrong. At minimum. A slight pause. He also would have watched that Valley footage 4 times and not said a word to anyone about it, but the 5th time you caught him, he'd have been crying. She looked at Briggs. Don't tell anyone I said that, he said. Who would I tell? He almost smiled. He loved you more than he knew how to say. That's not an excuse for what that cost you, the years of carrying everything he built in you and not being able to use it. I'm not making it romantic. He was quiet for a moment, but it was true. You should have all of it, the cost and the truth both. She nodded. Her throat was doing something she was managing. Take care of the rifle, Briggs said. I will. And call your mother more than you think you need to. I already do. He nodded, held out his hand. She shook it, and he held on for a second longer than a handshake strictly required, and that second held everything that neither of them was going to say, and then it was done, and she picked up her bag. Briggs, she said, turning back once. He looked at her. Thank you, for holding the letter, for watching, for... She stopped. For being the person he trusted to hand it off right. He stood with that for a moment. He chose right then. He did. She walked toward the aircraft. The Army sniper course at Fort Bragg ran 8 weeks and had a failure rate that nobody advertised, but everyone knew, and the class Lena Cross walked into on a cold November morning contained 19 other soldiers, all of them male, with an average of 6 years service and backgrounds ranging from infantry to rangers to one former Marine who'd somehow ended up cross-training and who regarded everyone else with the benign suspicion of a man who'd spent his career being slightly outnumbered. The cadre was 3 people, 2 staff sergeants she didn't know, and 1 evaluation board member who sat in the back row of the initial brief with his arm in a partial sling and a coffee cup that said "World's Okayest Shooter" in block letters. Pierce. He didn't acknowledge her when she came in. She didn't acknowledge him. They'd agreed to that on the phone 2 weeks earlier. Any appearance of familiarity would be ammunition for every person in the room who was already assembling a case for why she didn't belong there. She sat in the middle of the room, not the back, where you could disappear, and not the front, where you were performing eagerness. The middle, where you were just a person in a room who was there to work. The lead cadre instructor was a master sergeant named Rourke, who had the face of a man who'd been assessing people for a long time and had stopped being surprised by what he found. He walked them through the course structure in 20 minutes, the expectations in 10, and then looked around the room. Some of you are here because you're good, he said. Some of you are here because someone thought you were good. Those are 2 different things, and we will find out which one applies to each of you, and we will find out quickly. He paused. Any questions before we start? The Marine put up his hand. What's the pass rate? Sufficient, Rourke said, and moved on. The first week was fundamentals. Positional shooting, breath control, trigger discipline. Things Lena had been doing for 16 years. She didn't make the mistake of performing ease, because performing ease was its own kind of arrogance, and arrogance was visible. She worked. She asked questions when she had real questions. She made genuine errors on the range and corrected them without drama. By the end of week 1, she was second in the class on qualification scores. The soldier in first was a staff sergeant from the 75th Ranger Regiment named Kowalczyk, 28 years old, with the compact intensity of someone who'd been competing at everything since childhood and had made peace with the fact that competition was just the air he breathed. He shot clean groups at every distance and moved between positions like he'd been doing it his whole life, which he probably had. She studied his technique the way she studied everything, without announcing that she was doing it. He shot with a slightly different grip angle than she'd been trained in, and on the 4th day she asked him about it, directly, which seemed to catch him off guard. It's a wrist thing, he said. Reduces my vertical dispersion on shots over 500. I noticed. Does it affect your speed between positions? He looked at her for a moment. Slightly. I lose half a second on the positional change. Is that worth it at distance? He thought about it honestly. Yes. Okay. She went back to her lane. He watched her for a second before going back to his. They didn't become friends exactly. The course didn't have space for that, and Kowalczyk was too internally focused for casual friendship. But they developed a professional respect that was unspoken and mutual, the kind that forms between two people who recognize each other as operating at a similar level. By week 3, she was first in the class on qualification scores. Week 4 was stalking, fieldcraft, concealment, moving through terrain without being detected. This was where the course shed people, historically, because it required a different kind of patience than marksmanship, and patience was harder to train than trigger control. Lena was good at patience. She'd had years of practice. She spent 8 hours in week 4 lying in a simulated hide site, motionless, while the cadre walked the field trying to locate her. She'd chosen her position carefully, not the most concealed spot on the field, because the most concealed spots were obvious choices, and obvious choices got you found. She'd chosen a spot that looked like it offered only partial concealment, trusting that the searchers would spend less time on it on the assumption that nobody serious would pick it. Nobody found her. Rourke made a note on his clipboard and didn't say anything when she came in, but she saw the note being made and understood what it meant. Week 5. Wind reading. This was the most purely intellectual part of the course. The calculation of how moving air affected a bullet's path at distance, the ability to read mirage and flag movement and thermal patterns, and translate all of it into precise adjustments. The instruction here was good, rigorous, technically sound. She already knew most of it. She'd known most of it since she was 14. She didn't say that. She sat in the instruction and listened and asked questions that were genuinely about refining what she already understood, rather than demonstrating that she had it. And she made sure the questions sounded like the questions of a diligent student rather than a person who was bored, because she wasn't bored and she didn't want to perform being bored. After the week 5 qualification, Rourke kept her back when the others filed out. He looked at her scores on his clipboard, then at her. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "I've had training outside the formal program." "Who trained you?" She told him. She'd expected to have to say the name twice or explain who Victor Cross was. She didn't have to. Rourke stood with that for a moment. "Your wind reading in the course record today. You were adjusting for thermal layering at 2 different altitudes on the same shot. The target was on a slope. The air moved differently at my elevation than at the target elevation. Most shooters at this stage of training don't account for that. My father drilled it specifically. He said most people get the surface wind right and forget that the bullet spends time in other air on its way to the target." Rourke looked at her for another moment. "You could have come into this class and demonstrated that on day 1. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She held his gaze. "Because I'm here to get qualified, not to impress people. Getting qualified means completing the course correctly. Completing the course correctly means going through each stage like it matters, even if some of it is review." She paused. "My father also said, the moment you stop treating fundamentals as fundamental, you start building mistakes on top of mistakes." Rourke was quiet. "That's correct," he said finally. He put his clipboard under his arm. "Dismissed." She called her mother every Sunday. The calls ran between 20 minutes and an hour, depending on how the week had been, and they developed a pattern. Her mother asked specific questions, not vague ones, because she'd decided that vague questions let people get away with not actually saying anything. "How was your sleep? What did you eat today? Did you have any moments this week that were genuinely good, not just functional?" The genuinely good question was her mother's invention, and it had become Lena's favorite part of the week, trying to identify one true thing that had qualified. Week 6. Standing on the range at dusk when the light went that specific color, and the air smelled like pine and gunpowder. And I thought of Dad, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. Week 7. Kowalczyk asked me to spot for him on a difficult crosswind shot because he said my wind reads were cleaner than his, and he wanted to understand how I was doing it. We spent 2 hours on it. That was genuinely good. Her mother. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." "That's not the same as yes." "I know." Lena. "I'm sleeping. It's okay." Her mother was quiet for a moment. I got a letter from Colonel Hale last week. Did you know she wrote to me? She hadn't known. What did she say? She described what happened in the valley. She said, her mother's voice changed slightly. She said she wanted me to have an accurate account of what your daughter did and why it mattered, so that whatever you felt about it was based on the truth and not a second-hand version. Lena was quiet. She said you saved 12 people. Her mother paused. She also said, and I'm quoting, Specialist Cross demonstrated, under the most demanding possible conditions, exactly the character your husband spent his life hoping to build. You raised someone extraordinary. He did too. I thought you should hear that from someone who was there to see it. Lena sat on the edge of her bunk in the barracks and looked at the floor. Mom, I know. Her mother's voice was steady and warm and carried 24 years of knowing exactly when to let silence do the work. I know. The final qualification was on a Friday in week 8. 800 meters, wind variable, moving targets on a timed sequence. Standard course end evolution, designed to test everything: marksmanship, patience, wind reading, positional efficiency. The ability to perform under the specific pressure of knowing this was the one that counted. 19 students went to the range that morning. 4 had been dropped in the preceding weeks. 2 for marksmanship deficiency, 1 for a fieldcraft failure, 1 for a disciplinary issue that nobody talked about much. 15 remained. Lena went to the range that morning the same way she'd gone every morning. Kit prepped the night before, nothing left to scramble for, the rifle cleaned and zeroed and ready. She ate breakfast because her father had told her that people who skipped the meal before a qualification were negotiating with their own performance, and he had no patience for that. She ate the eggs even though they were not good eggs. She drank the coffee. She went to the range. Rourke walked the line before the start. He stopped at each position briefly, said something to each shooter. Different things, calibrated things, the particular skill of a good instructor who understood that different people needed different things in the last 10 minutes before a high-stakes evolution. He stopped at her position, looked at her setup, looked at the wind indicator down the range. "How's the wind?" he said. She'd been reading it for the last 20 minutes. Variable right to left at the surface, averaging 2 knots. Thermal lift off the target berm will push the round slightly high on the back half of the flight path. I'm holding slightly low and left. Rourke nodded once. Go shoot. She went to shoot. The sequence was 15 shots on moving targets at 800 meters, time limits per shot that required clean efficiency between positions. She didn't think about the score while she was shooting. She thought about each shot individually. The wind at the moment of the shot, not the wind she'd read 10 seconds ago, the wind right now. The way the Mirage at 400 meters was moving compared to the Mirage at 800. The way the target was moving, the lead she needed, the hold. 15 shots. She stayed on the range after the last shot and waited for the ceasefire and then walked the targets with Rourke and the evaluation board. 13 solid hits. 1 hit on the edge of the scoring zone, 1 miss. The 11th shot, where a gust had pushed harder than she'd read, and she'd pulled it slightly right, and she'd known it was wrong the moment she broke the trigger, and there was nothing to do about it once the trigger broke. 13 for 15 at 800 meters on moving targets. Course record. Kowalczyk shot 11. He found her after the scores were posted and shook her hand without commentary, which was exactly the right amount. Rourke gathered the class for the final brief. He talked for 10 minutes about what the qualification meant, what came next, what they were now qualified to do. Standard end-of-course language, but he delivered it without making it feel standard. Then he looked at the class. Best performance in this class. Specialist Cross, 13 for 15. He paused. Second best. Staff Sergeant Kowalczyk, 11 for 15. Another pause. Both of those scores are in the top 5 for this course since 2019. He closed his folder. Dismissed. Certificates are issued tomorrow morning, 0800. She walked off the range with the late afternoon light coming in low and sideways through the pines. The same color it had been in week 6 when she'd had her genuinely good moment, and she stopped walking for a second and just stood in it. Kowalczyk walked past her and said, without stopping, "Your old man would have been annoyed about the miss." "Yes," she said. "Still a course record." "Yes." He kept walking. She stood light a moment longer. Then she walked back to the barracks to clean the rifle. The ceremony the next morning was brief, which she appreciated. Certificates, a handshake from Rourke. Rourke, the badge. 15 people in a room doing the quiet administrative work of becoming officially what they'd spent 8 weeks proving they were. Pierce was there, arm out of the sling, watching from the back. After the class dispersed, she walked over to him. He looked at her for a moment, then at the badge she was holding. "How's the shoulder?" she said. 85%. He took the coffee cup from his other hand, looked at the world's okayest shooter text, which makes me at least as good as most people in that class. Kowalczyk would argue. Kowalczyk argues about everything. That's his best quality. He looked at her steadily. 13 for 15. 11th shot was wrong. I know, I watched it. He paused. The wind pushed. I should have read it cleaner. Yes. He held her gaze. You still shot a course record. She didn't say anything to that. Your father's rifle is being processed through the administrative return, Pierce said. Should be in your hands by end of next week. Full clear. It's yours officially now. He paused. How does that feel? She thought about the weight of it, the worn stock, the initials on the underside, the way it had felt in her hands in that drainage ditch in Kandahar province, not borrowed but recognized. Right, she said. It feels right. He nodded. Yeah. He looked out the window at the range, the tree line beyond it, the gray December sky above. He'd want you to use it. I know. She did know. She'd known it since she read the letter. She'd been knowing it slowly for 4 months, the way you know things that take time to arrive fully. Not a moment of revelation, but an accumulation, each day adding a layer until one morning, you wake up and the thing is simply there, obvious, like it had always been. She was going to use it. She was going to be exactly what her father had built her to be. Not instead of who she'd chosen to be, but alongside it. The two things not contradictory, but the same thing, the same person, carrying forward something that hadn't ended when he died. It had only gone quiet, waiting for the moment when it was needed, and she was ready for both to be true at once. She flew home to Ohio 10 days later. Her mother met her at the airport in the same coat she'd worn to the Wyoming range 20 years ago, a heavy green wool thing that smelled like home, in a way Lena had stopped being able to separate into its component parts. They stood in the arrivals hall and held each other for a long time without saying anything. Then her mother stepped back and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way mothers do. Not inspecting, just reading, the way you read something you know well and are checking to see what time is added to it. You look different, her mother said. Different how? Her mother considered. Like you're standing in the right place. Lena thought about that, about Kandahar province and the drainage ditch and the weight of a rifle that had traveled from her father's hands through other hands to find hers, about a valley that had tried to kill 12 people and failed, about a promise that had been made in grief and released in love and had cost her 7 years and given her back something she hadn't known was still whole, about a cold November morning on a range in Bragg with pine smell and gunpowder and light going amber through the trees. Yeah, she said, I think I am. Her mother took her bag. They walked out to the car together, and the Ohio winter came in cold and clean from the north, and Lena Cross walked into it without flinching. The ones who stay quiet the longest often have the most to say. The ones who are overlooked the hardest are sometimes the only ones who see clearly. Don't mistake someone's silence for emptiness. You may be standing next to exactly the person the moment needs, waiting for